Alrighty. Alrighty. Right. American entry into World War I presented the country and its military with significant challenges. Following early war isolationist sentiment, President Wilson resisted building up the U.S. military over pre-war levels, meaning that mobilization for the conflict had to be done quickly and in many different areas at once. Recruiting exploded, pre-war militias were federalized into the National Guard, and production of military goods expanded rapidly to clothe and equip an expeditionary force that more than quadrupled the size of the peacetime army. All the states played a role in mobilization, but I'm here to tell you a little bit about Arkansas's part. Of course, other speakers have already touched on this this morning, so you'll hear some echoes. And this was America's first experience with what historian Captain B.H. Little Hart termed mechanical warfare. They engaged with this in several ways, and that support for the war brought people of the state together and also drew some fairly stark distinctions amongst them at the same time. I've been asked to focus on manufacturing, which I'm going to understand to include a number of different things. The quickest read is that manufacturing means items made for the war in Arkansas factories, and this is actually the smaller of the sort of two components. The larger one is the manufacture or the production of raw materials that fed war industries housed elsewhere outside of the state. Being as we are the natural state, we always, natural resources have been a big part of our economy. So, of course, that's going to factor in heavily. So what follows is a look into how the state geared up over here to prepare to send Arkansans and Americans more generally over there. All right, so mobilization for the Great War was a completely different process from earlier wars. In earlier conflicts, smaller ones such as the Spanish-American War or the Indian Wars, where they were small enough that government arsenals could supply most necessities. The Civil War was, of course, a much larger challenge, but in that situation, both sides, though they had some level of centralized production, that centralization was mostly at the state level, particularly in the South. National centralization that we see during the First World War is really a completely new kind of orientation. And this comes around at a really interesting time because the First World War hits right at the same time that scientific principles of management are all the rage in business circles. And so those two sort of trends coming together, the size of the war and the basically managerial culture, produce a completely different, much more centralized and much more heavily networked war effort. Industrialists across the country clamored for a mobilization plan long before we joined the war in 1917. President Woodrow Wilson initially resisted creating a plan as he faced significant anti-involvement sentiment nationwide. Several federal offices undertook small efforts to plan for wartime manufacturing, but it was not until April of 1916 that any effort actually made headway. That month, the Navy created the Naval Consulting Board, headed by none other than Thomas Edison. Subsidiary to that was a Committee on Industrial Preparedness, which was tasked with gathering information on industries that could be turned to war production. This is an ad for the Industrial Preparedness Committee, encouraging people to, when asked, tell how their factory could come to contribute. And this is called the impending conflict, and you see the U.S. is crowned with science and armed with the sword of invention. So this is very, very much a sort of science-led effort. All right. So the CIP established subcommittees in each state composed of members of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the American Institute of Mining Engineers, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, and the American Chemical Society. These are all industries that were believed to be crucial to the war effort. In Arkansas, the state chapter consisted of J.B. Rather, B.N. Wilson, and W.N. Gladson of the University of Arkansas, and C.H. Miller and John R. Fordyce of Little Rock, both private businessmen. In the summer of 1916, as the French and Germans vied for control of Verdun, the U.S. Congress moved to expand war planning and approve the Council of National Defense, which Mrs. Hill mentioned earlier. This was an organization that would bring together military, political, scientific, and business leaders to prepare the country for war. At its inception, President Wilson stated that, quote, "From an economic point of view, there is now very little difference between the machinery required for commercial efficiency and that required for military purpose," unquote. This heralded, as historian Paul Koistinen writes, the birth of the military-industrial complex. To support the CND, each state formed a state committee of defense, again, previously mentioned. I think we've seen this exact photo already once today. Under which formed county committees of defense and even some community committees of defense. So it's multi-tiered. From federal to the community level, manufacturing and war-related production were integrated to an extent not seen before in American history. Arkansas State Council of Defense first met in May of 1917, jumping into work on food production, fuel conservation, public health, college attendance, because it's important to have smart people working in your war industries, and the formation of a home guard to offset losses to police forces created when police officers volunteered for the U.S. military. In addition to coordinating production and manufacturing, the committees of defense at all levels also managed quote-unquote public morale. This meant two things. First, it meant education, as the committees put together speakers who could explain the reasons for American involvement in the conflict, the importance of working long hours, the dangers of unions, and other topics deemed important to the war effort. You already had a sample of one of the 4-minute speeches. They also, these committees of defense also served as the usual reporting places to which talk, meetings, and writings considered disloyal to the American cause could be made known to authorities. So there's a little bit of a thought police angle to this as well. All right, so during the war, the Council of National Defense created 3 major subcommittees: the Food Administration, the Fuel Administration, and the War Industries Board. The state, county, and community councils of defense all coordinated with these branches. Of these, the War Industries Board dealt most with manufacturing, so we'll dive a little deeper into that story. Arguably our biggest contribution, as already mentioned, was the production of raw materials, so we can start there. Now, Arkansas's economy at the time pivoted around 2 natural resources: timber and cotton. Both experienced a small boom between 1915 and 1917, when American business became deeply involved in the European conflict. This boom helped the economy adjust to the needs of global conflict, and prices for both timber and cotton rose during that time. Again, been mentioned already. The Council of Defense also played a role coordinating production and implementing price controls. The war increased demand for forest products markedly. Before American involvement, sales to France and England drove prices up. Both of those countries lacked manpower as their lumbermen were in service, and also lacked sufficient timber for their needs. France was actually cut off from its forests in the east, which, stumbling all over that, which were either turned into cratered moonscapes by battle or occupied by German soldiers. On top of that increased demand, America's mobilization created yet greater need. Those needs focused on timber used to construct barracks, hospitals, training camps, administrative facilities, and arsenals across the country. On the front lines, men needed supports for dugout shelters, duck boards to keep their feet out of the mud, and fence posts to support barbed wire. Oil and gasoline went to the front to fuel wood-framed airplanes, they shipped in wooden barrels. Gun barrels needed by millions of foot soldiers required hardwood stocks. In an era before synthetic materials were widely available, wood was the versatile medium used to produce much of what armies lived in and carried with them. So Arkansas's timber stands helped answer that need. The state was 6th nationwide in the value of forest products at the time of the war, ahead of all southern states save Louisiana and Mississippi. Timber resources accounted for 51.4% of the value of all manufactured goods in the state. And this was Arkansas's largest manufacturing industry, separate from agricultural. The focus of the industry was on yellow pine and cypress, which grew in all corners of the state, and this was what we use for construction and container production. But the state also led the country in hardwood production. It was a major producer of oak, red gum, hickory, elm, ash, and cottonwood. And walnut from eastern Arkansas was shipped to Memphis to be turned into thousands of rifle stocks. We also led the way in the production of both tight and slack cooperage, which was industry speak for barrels meant to hold liquids and solids, respectively. The Factorio addition on Little Rock's east side was home to barrel factories before the war, and their production readily diverted to military purposes when we actually joined the effort. Demand for wood was not solely for military consumption. The Fuel Administration sought to limit consumption of coal and natural gas among civilians, keeping it free to be used by the military and the railroads, who need it for transportation and to fuel high-temperature fires in smelters, furnaces, and factories. Instead, the Fuel Administration encouraged citizens to burn wood for both heating and cooking. Our other major business at the time, cotton, is not conventionally considered a manufacturing industry, but there are some side products that are considered part of that. Cotton byproducts were Arkansas's second leading manufacturing sector. So a cotton gin produces, of course, bales of cotton. But besides that, gins put out a large quantity of cottonseed and what is referred to as linters, which are the little strands of cotton left on a seed after it's ginned. They actually have a good industrial use. The seeds, for instance, could either be saved for next year's crop or could be crushed for their oil, which was usable in cooking. If you have a tub of Crisco in your kitchen, you are using crystallized cottonseed oil, or at least it was. That's where the name comes from. With the oil removed, the crushed seed could be sold in cakes and fed to cattle, so no waste. The humble linter was also worth something, though not in an industry you might expect. Smokeless gunpowder requires cellulose, basically plant material that can be finely crushed to burn very rapidly. Arms manufacturers found that when treated with proper chemicals, linters made fine cellulose. What otherwise might seem a waste product actually had a crucial military application. In Arkansas, cotton oil firms baled and shipped linters to munitions plants across the country throughout the war. To list just a few instances, the Warren Cotton Oil and Manufacturing Company in Bradley County shipped 1,500 bales of linters, requiring 65 train cars to Memphis in 1916 alone. Pine Bluff in that same year sent 37 cars worth of linters to powder mills in Rhode Island. So this was a pretty substantial output. Though cotton and timber were big products, other more modest contributions were made and bear recounting here. Our mining industry, for instance, though small in comparison to agricultural produce, had a very definite and important role. The major portion of Arkansas's mining produce, about 63% of the total, focused on bituminous coal, mined in the northern Ouachita Mountains, particularly around Boone, Scott, Sebastian, Franklin, and Logan counties. As mentioned above, coal was crucial for war industries in the east and the railroads that moved goods and soldiers. After coal, Arkansas's major mined resource was bauxite, extracted from Pulaski and Saline counties. We were the leading producer of bauxite in the country at the time. And this was important in that bauxite is our primary aluminum ore. And the Great War was the first during which aluminum was commonly used. Soldiers wore some aluminum insignia, ate from aluminum mess tins, and drank from aluminum canteens. The light but strong metal also went into bicycles, automobiles, and aircraft used by our armies. A few other metals, such as copper, zinc, antimony, and manganese, were mined in Boone, Sevier, Washington, Yale, Montgomery, and Pike counties during the war. So this is, all over the state. These were valuable to the war effort either as primary components of uniform and equipment, or as alloying agents added to some other metal to produce desired quantities. Iron ore was, of course, very important to the war effort, though it was not actually widely mined in Arkansas. There was some mined around Eureka Springs and in Howard County. Our production was actually so low that the industrial census of the time just simply lump Arkansas in with all other states categories. Fairly ignominious distinction. The leather trade was another manufacturing sector that Arkansas played a small role in, but definite. In the years before nylon, soldiers wore leather belts, leather boots, had a leather brim on a cap, wore leather gloves, and with military aviation came the need for heavily fur-lined leather flying gear. Arkansas was not a top leather producer at the time. A nationwide leather shortage created by military demand drove up prices and encouraged production. To help increase the supply available to the military, the Arkansas State Council of Defense pushed two policies through the legislature. First, it established a ban on the consumption of veal. This was done to increase the supply of beef and also ensure that the full-grown hides were available for sale to the military. Second, the state set out regulations for keeping stock out of railroad right-of-ways and encouraged fencing, particularly inside city limits, so it's done to keep the animals off the track and thereby reduce the amount of leather and meat lost to cow train collisions. While this measure invokes a somewhat gruesome set of mental images, it may seem like a sort of strange thing to focus a lot of energy on. In August of 1918 alone, 166 head of cattle were struck by trains on Arkansas railroads. So weight loss was significant, and the conservation was fairly important, actually. Of course, at the time of the war, about 88% of Arkansans were farmers. And so some of that's going to be cotton, but a lot of that's going to be food as well. And, production from farms is going to feed not just the U.S. military, it's feeding French and British soldiers and civilians as well. We've already sort of touched on this in some of these other talks. And the various levels of the Council of National Defense, working through the Food Administration, coordinated production to increase the available supply of food. And this was administered on the county level by specially appointed council members who worked to minimize wastage and coordinate growing, harvesting, and milling. The farmers who did their part actually received a small placard that they could place on their mailbox or fence posts, letting neighbors know that they were doing their bit. Rice production also involved the state council. Labor shortages required some coordination, bringing in workers from elsewhere across the state. So they're very active in that area as well. And then besides simply coordinating production, the state council also worked on measures of economy and restraint consumption, and encouraged farmers to donate a bushel of their produce or the equivalent value thereof to the war effort. So it's something that was so successful that the National Council of Defense picked this up and pushed this out to farmers nationwide. So that's sort of the brief version of Arkansas's raw material aspect of manufacturing. And it's a major part of the story because we simply weren't a major industrial state at the time of the war. There was, however, one major wartime factory that you should know about because it's underappreciated, in my opinion, but I spent a lot of time researching it, so of course, I'm biased. And I want to start talking about that a little bit now. So, the Arkansas State Council of Defense's report on its activities during the war identified 4 major war industries in the state. This is their list. Camp Pike, which of course is now Camp Joseph T. Robertson, Ebert's Field, and the aviation warehouse, and something known as the Little Rock Picric acid plant. They make no mention of Fort Roots for some reason. Camp Pike, of course, trained thousands of soldiers for service in Europe. Ebert's Field, which you have a photo of on the program, prepared others for the Army Air Corps. The aviation warehouse, located in East Little Rock, supplied and shipped airplane parts to airfields across the country, from the southwest to Florida. The Little Rock Picric acid plant stands apart in that it was the only one that was an actual factory, and presents us with a unique aspect of Arkansas's involvement in the Great War manufacturing. So, picric acid is not a watery liquid as we often sort of think of acids being. Rather, it's usually encountered in a crystalline form, though it's also often held in a little bit of a solution. It was very valuable during the war in that it is an extremely powerful high explosive, even more destructive than TNT, which we use now. It replaced black powder in artillery shells starting in the 1890s, and as such was one of the factors in making the battlefields of the First World War so incredibly dangerous and battle-scarred. Though it is extremely destructive, picric acid is also generally very stable, unlike nitroglycerin, and can be trusted to explode only when intended, mostly. In liquid form, it is largely insensitive to shock and vibration, and will only detonate when acted upon by a fuse. This made it suitable for artillery shells, as a shell filled with picric acid would not go off in the cannon barrel, killing friendly troops. Once it flew downrange, however, its fuse would function and it would explode with tremendous force. Beyond these explosive qualities, picric acid is also the basis of chloropicrin, a chemical warfare agent. Chloropicrin is a gas that is lethal on its own, that can be taken in either through respiration or through skin contact. Those exposed to it would, at a minimum, become violently sick to their stomach, and both sides used chloropicrin as a lethal gas and as what is called a mask-breaking gas, meaning it would be mixed with something more lethal, such as phosgene, and when exposed to both, the chloropicrin would sicken the soldiers and they would have to remove their gas masks so they didn't drown in basically their vomit, at which time when they pull the gas mask off, the more lethal gas is there to do them in. We use chloropicrin extensively, but also sold it in great quantities to the French army. Picric acid did have an unfortunate tendency to form explosive crystals when it contacted metal, making it harder to store and much more dangerous than TNT. There were industrial accidents in English picric acid plants during the war that killed literally scores of workers. And on December 6, 1917, a French transport loaded with picric acid struck a Norwegian ship in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The resulting explosion measured approximately 2.9 kilotons and was the most destructive or most powerful explosion in human history until the atomic bomb. It killed 2,000 people and destroyed Halifax's shipping docks. So this is really intense stuff. When the Great War began, only one government and a few private firms in the United States manufactured picric acid. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 spurred demand from all sectors, and the U.S. government decided that the country needed to produce more picric acid. As a result, the War Industries Board announced that it would let contracts for 3 new picric acid facilities, attracting bids from cities across the country. 3 cities, Memphis, Tennessee, Louisville, Kentucky, and Little Rock, emerged as top contenders for one of those contracts. Since I am spending so much time talking about the subject, clearly Little Rock's bid won, and also trolling did not start with social media. I love this. The victory was largely due to the efforts of George Furman and Ed Cornish of the Little Rock Board of Commerce. They offered the military cheap land, rail connections, and some existing buildings in a city blessed by a temperate climate and relatively weak labor unions. Plus, they believed that Arkansas could furnish the 2,000 construction workers and 4,000 munition workers that the plant would require. So this is going to be a really extensive facility. Citizens hailed the good news by celebrating in the streets on May 21st, 1918. The $10 million facility was both an immediate boon to the economy and the beginning of a new chapter in Arkansas's economic history, so people really hoped. The state, they felt, would go from a wholly agricultural economy to one that had a little more of a balance with industrial production. The place chosen for the facility was an area known as the Factorio Addition in eastern Little Rock. This was the focus of central Arkansas's industrial development before the war, and the presence of existing plants that could be turned to military use factored in the city's bid. And before the war, Factorio included several woodworking plants, focusing on making barrels and veneers, and a cannery that churned out hominy and canned vegetables. Rail lines connected with Argenta, now North Little Rock, and Factorio was set to be the hub of Arkansas's lush manufacturing future, if you believe the many booster stories in the Arkansas Gazette and Arkansas Democrat at the time. So work began on the Picric acid plant with great zeal, as orders for building material went out within days of announcement of the contract. 400,000 board feet of lumber came in, along with 600,000 bricks, and then tons of glass, iron, and other construction materials. The companies brought in to operate the plant, Pratt Engineering and the Everly M. Davis Chemical Company, hired construction workers by the hundreds. These laborers came either out of Little Rock, which provided a convenient commuter workforce, or from farther afield, and took up residence in the bunkhouses and dining halls constructed at the facility. As for munition workers were in the papers as soon as mid-June, and newspaper stories indicated that munition and construction workers labored next to each other throughout the war. By the armistice, construction was 90% complete, and the plant was operating at 50% of planned maximum. So what did the Little Rock Picric acid plant look like? Well, it's not clear. There are actually no depictions of it in period newspapers, and I'm still waiting on images from the National Archives. They have a surprisingly long wait time. There are a few pictures of the sister facility at Brunswick, Georgia, which was about twice as large, built by a completely different set of hands. So I'm not sure they necessarily convey a good sense of what Little Rock's would have looked like. What we do have is a 1921 depiction of the closed plant drawn from the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps. For those not familiar with these, the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company, as this name suggests, offered fire insurance and therefore had a business need to know where buildings were, what they looked like, and what they were made of. Archaeologists love these things a lot. To aid their business, they produced a series of very useful maps for cities across the United States, noting the footprint, standing height, and construction materials for pretty much any building that they might wind up insuring. Fortunately, the 1921 Little Rock set include the Picric acid plant, though it's at the very edge of their coverage, so we almost missed it. The thing that really sets Picric acid apart from other high explosives that were being tested at the time was its use of phenol as a base. Phenol is a crystalline substance distilled from coal tar, which is, you get coal tar as a byproduct from breaking coal into coke and coal gas. Also known as carbolic acid or coal oil acid, phenol was discovered in the 19th century and developed into a high explosive. At the Little Rock facility, phenol came from a coal oil refinery built in the northeastern corner of the facility. We see it here surrounded by a couple of storage tanks and several boilers. The nitric and sulfuric acid required to produce picric acid from phenol were both manufactured on site. The sulfuric acid building lay on the eastern edge of the plant and was a two-story wood frame building clad with metal sheeting. A shed housing sulfur burners stood immediately to the west, and without giving too close instructions on how to produce hazardous chemicals or high explosives in a public forum, suffice it to say here that sulfuric acid involved the reduction of sulfur in those burners before it was rendered into an acid actually at the plant. So they could actually produce all the constituent parts in the facility. The nitric acid building sat east of the sulfuric one and contained a production room, storage tanks, furnaces, and a storage building. Producing nitric acid required sodium nitrate, which workers would treat with sulfuric acid to produce nitric acid. So we're stretching the bounds of an archaeologist's understanding of chemicals and doing this. So I know it can get a little rough. With phenol, nitric acid, and sulfuric acid all produced on site, the plant can make all the ingredients for picric acid. Combining them, I think, in the concentration building, which would have steam coils running through combination tanks to keep the mixture at a constant temperature while it was agitated over a 24-hour period. All right, and the whole thing received power from what is in 1921 identified as the Arkansas Light and Power Company power plant. This was built to light the facility during the war. What the Sanborn map does not pick up is the community that began to form around the picric acid plant. This community survives today as the Cherry Acres area north of the plant, and the community once known as Picric to the south. So Cherry Acres is still a name you might hear around Little Rock. Picric disappeared into College Station, though both Google and Zillow maintain geographic coordinates for it. So you can actually, you've got Picric, Arkansas real estate. I love that. All right. Both Picric and Cherry Acres contained housing lots, and construction firms built dozens of homes big enough for small families. Those lots were designed to be big enough to have a house along with a garden and even some cows, chicken, and pigs. So this is home production, as we've already been hearing about. But that bucolic imagery masks a few realities about life and work in the plant. First, work there was quite dangerous. The workers were making a high explosive out of a petroleum derivative and two strong acids. So the potential for grievous workplace injuries was ever present. Right. Second, those hazards went beyond the obvious forms of exposure. Crystals from the plant could settle on clothing, hair, and skin, often turning the workers a pale shade of yellow. Period documents use the term canaries to refer to workers because it would literally be stained yellow from the process. And in England, at least, a few women gave birth to yellow babies after working in picric acid plants. So this was some intense stuff. And the early 20th century is not known for workplace safety quality. Right, not all dangers were chemical. To keep the plant going, Picric formed its own police force that apparently rivaled the size and efficiency of the Little Rock Police Department. Though we don't have accounts for the Little Rock plant, workers at the Brunswick, Georgia facility suggested that the police force serves the company and the government first and cultivated a reputation for being hard on workers and compelling labor in some highly unsafe conditions. There's actually some depositions about this dating to the war. Don't know whether this factored into people's willingness to work, but there were constant shortages of laborers at the plant. So the first ads that went out for trying to recruit the 4,000 workers needed went just to Little Rock. A couple months later, they're going to Jonesboro, they're going to Texarkana looking for folks, they're going down to Pine Bluff, trying to pull people in from a much wider area. More drastic measures were soon needed. Little Rock even put together a work draft by identifying non-essential job categories that people could then be basically compelled to go to Little Rock picric acid plant to work. So if you were a chauffeur, a bowling lane operator, a barber, a tobacconist, florist, dance instructor, elevator operator, or soft drink manufacturer, they might come for you. Ultimately, though, the answer for the shortage appears to have come from even farther afield. The Department of Labor founded the U.S. Employment Service and opened a branch in the old post office on Markham Street, which still stands. And from here, orders went out to Puerto Rico. They shipped in something like 1,500 Puerto Rican laborers to come staff the plant and fulfill shortfalls. And unfortunately, they pretty much plucked these guys right out of the fields and brought them to Arkansas to work around chemicals wearing pretty much the attire that you see here, which is barefoot, maybe they have sandals and just linen clothing. And citizens of Little Rock actually staged a clothing drive to acquire something more substantial for these guys to work in. Unfortunately, they were also here during the Spanish flu epidemic, and some of them never went home. And if you go to the Cavalry Cemetery on Woodward here in Little Rock, there's a cenotaph for 66 Puerto Rican laborers who died at Picric during the war, and that's plant staff. All right, so unlike the other bid out contracts, the Little Rock plant actually went into production during the war. The one in Georgia didn't, the other one, which was in Michigan, never actually produced any picric acid. So the mere fact that Arkansans managed to go from the bidding process to a functioning munitions plant within the space of 7 months is really quite remarkable. It was, however, short-lived. So, of course, the world rejoiced when the armistice went into effect. Soldiers would be coming home, the war was over. Though papers around Little Rock do express some concern immediately after celebrating the armistice that the plant would close. The Army wasn't sure that they wanted to keep it in operation, and there was some hope that, okay, if they're not going to make picric acid, industrial chemicals such as sulfuric and nitric acids, maybe we can keep it open for that. The Army wound up dashing those hopes by suspending production in December of 1918. It had decided to shift to TNT for a high explosive and no longer needed to supply France or Britain. So we didn't really have need for picric acid anymore. Eventually the facility sold at auction for $750,000, a fraction of the $7 million originally spent on the plant. The winning bidder was Harvey Couch, former fuel administrator and owner of the Arkansas Power and Light Company. Couch really bought it for the power station, which we saw on the Sanborn map. And he broke up most of the other buildings, selling off like lead linings from the acid tanks and other fittings for the buildings. Right, okay. All right, so the Great War is a fascinating period in a historical period, both nationally and here in Arkansas. The people of the state worked hard to contribute to the war effort and produce substantial quantities of the thing America needed to make war on Germany and its allies. That simple statement encompasses a vast array of processes, contestations, and debates that simply just only had time to scratch the surface on here, but made the period one of great complexity and also possibility. Many traces of that time remain with us today. Most obvious is the combination of our military and our economy, still known as military-industrial complex. Today, Arkansas manufacturers produce rocket propellants, grenades, small arms ammunition, machinery, flares, chaff, explosives, missile guidance systems, and loading systems for munitions of all kinds, plus a lot more stuff. In 2016 alone, defense contracts netted Arkansas $176 million. Though massively expanded during the Cold War, that system is born of the Great War. And the picric acid plant is sort of that first real footprint of that here in Arkansas. The war remains with us in other ways. As mentioned, when the picric acid plant closed, Harvey Couch, native of Columbia County, where Magnolia is, go Mule Riders, purchased it. He used the power station there to connect Little Rock and Pine Bluff in what became the state's first electrical grid. This was one of the core elements of Couch's company, Arkansas Power and Light, which endures with us today as part of Entergy Corporation, and now supplies power to about 700,000 Arkansans. By and large, however, a state whose contribution, whose largest industries were agricultural, weren't turned into an industrial powerhouse by the war. In some significant ways, the promise of the new industrial age did not pan out. And this is probably, at least in part, due to the fact that Little Rock picric acid plant did not endure. The government chose, since the government chose not to use picric acid anymore, they also didn't really have any plans to use the stockpiles of picric acid after the war, at least the military didn't. As a result, it classified over 11 million pounds of stuff of picric acid as surplus and gave it to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who trained farmers how to use it to remove stumps. Over time, the plant's buildings were stripped of usable materials, and the eastern half of it became a bauxite quarry in the 1950s. Today, Interstate 440 cuts through the northern portion of the plant's footprint, and the remaining western half is now at the location of the Holiday Inn Express at Bankhead Drive. Its effacement from the landscape is complete. I've stayed in this hotel many times with no ill effects, so they're fine. Not trying to kill their business. The only place that we can find the real sort of material traces of the plant is the still scarred landscape in northern France and Belgium, where shells from the war, including those filled with Arkansas picric acid, pop up by the thousands every year in what that is referred to as the iron harvest. Some estimates suggest this may take another 500 years to completely remediate. This is one of the unfortunately long-lasting legacies of Arkansas's manufacturing sector during the Great War. Thank you. Oh, do you have questions? Sorry.
Is that a Korean missile or is that an environment?
That is one of ours. I think that's coming out of East Camden. Well, it's not necessarily being fired out of East Camden, but it's being produced down in East Camden.
It's an MLRS, right?
Yep. Anybody else?
Do we know anything about small arms production? Was there any kind of weapons being produced?
Mostly that's going.
Just the rifle stocks?
It's the stalks and the cellulose from the cotton linters, or most of those plants are elsewhere. It's really just the picric acid plant is the only real manufacturing activity in the state, like factory manufacturing.
I think I recall you saying that when the rifle stocks went to Memphis, was there arms production there? Do you remember about that specifically?
That's one that I haven't chased down.
Okay.
And that the reference for that I think is coming out of the book on cutting the last hardwood stands, last old growth hardwood stands in Arkansas, whose exact title I'm blanking on at the moment.
Could you talk briefly about the use of picric acid on bandages?
Yeah. So amongst all the things picric acid does, it was found before the war to have some efficacy as a treatment for burns. And so you'd find they would take liquid picric acid and impregnate bandages with it, include them in first aid kits, and send those out. And they actually, they did good service like that. And this is something the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts both offered picric acid laced bandages and first aid kits into I think the 1930s. But of course, when picric acid dehydrates, it forms those little salts that are very, very susceptible to friction and heat from any kind of source. And you can actually have explosive first aid kits. And there's a period in the 1970s when one of these kind of went off, and fire departments from around the state went around actually collecting old first aid kits and taking them out into fields and detonating them, for lack of a better term. And if anyone in the room know Reverend Beverly Watkins from Sherwood, she was actually part of one of the volunteer fire department crews around Camden that went out and collected these things. She actually has some first-hand knowledge of this. But if you see an old first aid kit like in a second-hand store, you maybe treat that kind of gingerly, because that can be kind of dangerous.
What year did you say it was?
I want to say it was like 1973.
73.
Yeah. But this was, and I have some friends who specialize in unexploded ordnance demolition, and anything that's got picric acid in it, they're very, very nervous about, because those little crystals can form when they come in contact with any kind of metal. And so, yeah, the shells that you saw being loaded all had to have a special lining painted into them. And if that lining was ever faulty, those salts could form. And if you try to, like, say, back out a fuse from an unexploded shell and get one of those tiny little crystals caught in a thread, it can set the whole thing off. And this is, TNT doesn't do this, which is why everybody uses TNT now. Picric acid, sort of last major use, is by Japan during World War II.
The industry that got started in World War I, were there any lessons or guidelines that were utilized when industry came into Arkansas during the Second World War?
Well, it's actually, so it's sort of an interesting history as far as, the way in which the economy was mobilized even before in World War I comes into play, not just in World War II, but also during the Great Depression. And that a lot of those New Deal programs take as a model for how to basically nationalize an economy around a centralized administration. That comes out of the Committees for National Defense. And so, since this is how we organized in World War I, people had lived experience with that, and that makes the New Deal much more possible. And then World War II, again, we have massive expansion of the military and the military-industrial complex. This is building on that World War I experience. Thank you.